You're watching Euronews now. I'm Tukumbo Silako with your top stories. President Volodymyr Zelensky tells G7 leaders Ukraine needs more weapon support and sanctions to protect itself against Russia's renewed attacks. We'll hear from the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who's been talking about taking unified action to deal with the rising cost of living and the energy crisis. Also in the programme, playing for prestige and not for points. As Wimbledon gets underway, we'll look at the favourites to win the latest Grand Slam title.
Russia's war in Ukraine is, as expected, dominating the meeting in Germany of leaders of the world's richest economies, be it the need to put on a show of unity or in discussions over ways of minimising its effect on rising global food prices and energy costs. By the end of day one, world powers said they're set to ban gold exports from Russia, which will turn up the heat on Moscow. Earlier, summit host Germany's Chancellor underlined the need for the G7 to assume the responsibilities together.
All G7 countries are concerned about the crises we're currently facing. Declining growth rates in some countries, rising inflation, shortage of raw materials and supply chain disruptions. And that's why we must assume our responsibilities together.
But aside from discussions about the ongoing war, the G7 leaders also announced a $600 billion infrastructure initiative, a third of it from the United States. It's designed to counter China's influence in the developing world.
We're here today because we're making this commitment together as a G7 in coordination with one another to maximize the impact of our work. Collectively, we aim to mobilize nearly $600 billion from the G7 by 2027.
On the side of the main talks, there are also numerous bilateral meetings being held, while the leaders of India, Argentina and South Africa are among the other countries invited to join discussions today. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is due to address the G7 by video link.
With the G7 summit underway in Bavaria, climate change activists have held protests nearby. Around 900 people took part. They are calling for more action from world leaders to combat global warming. The rally was accompanied by a massive contingent of security forces. A total of 18,000 police officers were deployed in the region for the summit.
At worst, of course, I expect decisions that make poor people in the world even poorer and promote hunger even more because the interest of economic growth and so on. We know that economic growth is precisely against the interest of poor people and against the environment.
Meanwhile, more activists dressed as leaders from the group of 7 countries and staged another demonstration near the G7 summit venue. Wearing traditional Bavarian garb and oversized heads resembling those of US President Joe Biden, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and other leaders, the activists pretended to roast a planet Earth over a grill. The activists are calling for the heads to fulfill their commitment to the Paris Agreement. Residents from the eastern city of Kharkiv woke up to more destruction after Russian shelling caused widespread damage, triggering several fires to break out. Earlier, the capital, Kyiv, had come under attack for the first time in 3 weeks. Ukrainian firefighters retrieved a victim's body following a missile strike which hit an apartment building. Ukraine says 14 missiles were fired at the Kyiv region on Sunday, but the strikes extended far beyond the capital. Russia has denied hitting a civilian target and later announced strikes against 3 military centres in the north and western Ukraine, including one near the border with Poland. In his nightly address, President Zelensky called on the West for more air defence weapons.
Part of the missiles were shot down, but only a part. We need a powerful air defense, modern, fully effective and which can ensure complete protection against these missiles. We talk about this with our partners every day.
Huge clouds of smoke rose over Lysychansk oil's refinery and the surrounding industrial zone in Ukraine's eastern region of Donbass, as the battle with Russian forces intensified following the capture of the neighbouring city of Severodonetsk.
Inside a church in this working-class neighborhood of Madrid, a small group of protesters are preparing to demonstrate against this week's NATO summit in Madrid. People here are experiencing the harsh consequences of the war in Ukraine, of rising prices of food and energy. For them, asking for peace is more than a moral statement, and they believe NATO is responsible for the situation.
What we call the Ukraine war is not a war between Russia and Ukraine, it's a war between NATO and Russia.
The Spanish left has been traditionally against NATO. During Soviet times, they saw the alliance as the iron fist of American imperialism. Some still believe NATO is an instrument to advance the United States agenda.
When the Soviet Union disappeared, what happened was that NATO didn't disappear as well. In fact, it took advantage of there not being a counterpower to reinforce NATO as an intervention tool.
In Madrid, thousands gathered against NATO and called for peace talks to end the war in Ukraine. The demonstration has been backed by the leftist parties in the coalition government of Pedro Sánchez, which is organizing the NATO summit in Madrid. The demonstrators think an armed response is not the solution to end the conflict.
Of course, we are also opposed to Putin, and this is also a central message. But we also think the response to Putin can't be the militarization of our societies.
Critics of the demonstration say putting the spotlight on NATO is distracting attention from the real problem, which is the suffering of Ukrainian people caused by an unjustified Russian invasion.
With world leaders arriving in Madrid in just a few days, this is certainly not the image Spain would like to be projecting to the world. But the government insists 80% of Spaniards now support NATO. In Madrid, Jaime Velázquez, Euronews.
Part of a wooden stand has collapsed during a bullfight in central Colombia, sending spectators plunging to the ground. At least 4 people are reported dead, and about 30 others are seriously injured. The disaster took place in a stadium in the city of El Espinal in Tolima State during a traditional event called a corraleja, in which members of the public enter the ring to engage the bulls.
Dozens of people were detained in central Istanbul on Sunday after city authorities banned an LGBTQ+ pride march. At least 150 people are thought to have been arrested. Police loaded demonstrators and journalists onto buses, which were then driven away. Local residents banged pots and pans on their windows and balconies in a show of support for the marchers.
Prince Charles is facing fresh controversy over funding for his charities following reports he accepted a carrier bag full of cash from a Qatari billionaire. On 3 occasions, donations were handed to him in this manner. Once it was around €1 million. Although there is no suggestion of any illegality, critics say it raises serious concerns about the future king's personal judgment.
NASA has conducted the first of 3 launches from the Arnhem Space Centre in Darwin, Australia. It's the space industry's first ever blast-off from a commercial site outside of the US. Resembling a mini Hubble telescope, the technology aboard this rocket will capture data on star systems. NASA says it will unlock new possibilities for scientists studying distant galaxies in the southern hemisphere.
You're watching Euronews now. Still lots more to come on the programme. Don't go anywhere.